I'm going to paint the sky wet in wet. I'm going all the way across. I'm trying to be as fair as possible using the same colour mixes, same sort of dilution. So I'm starting off with some Naples Yellow Deep. I'm using my size 10 round black velvet brush, just working my way along that horizon there. It's interesting just to see the differences already. This is a little bit of Cobalt Violet light. I'm just painting that between the yellow because I'm going to apply some blue, and I didn't want the blue turning the yellow green, so it's quite a nice little tip there, especially when you're painting skies. So as you can see there, the difference with the textures, but especially between the hot pressed and the rough, you can see that texture there. I'm applying some Cinnerous blue here, wet into wet, and then ultramarine mixed with some Indian red. You could use burnt sienna, and I will have colour alternatives in the description below. So just applying that wet in wet, leaving some gaps for the clouds, still using that size 10 brush. So all the colours are the same here, but if you look now, I've stopped the film and just look, really compare the right hand side to the left, not the one in the middle. So that's a hot pressed on the left, rough on the right. You can see the difference with the textures, and the cold press is somewhere in the middle. So that gives you some sort of idea, these sort of textures on the surface of the papers. So what I'm doing now is I'm just testing off how easy it is to lift off the paint. So I'm using some paper towel here that's damp, just lifting off, and to be quite honest, they're all lifting off really nicely. So what I'm doing now, wet on dry, I'm painting the sea, and I'm using my size 14 round brush, working wet on dry. Remember, I've got wax resist here and masking fluid over the white sail. As you can see there on the left there, as I'm painting, I'm touching the damp sky because I want to see what happens when the paint runs up. So as you can see there, the hot pressed is traveling the most, and the cold pressed not as much, and then the rough the least amount. And you'll find with hot press paper the paint really moves quickly because it's smooth, and the rougher the paper, the more dimples in the paper, it stops the painting running. The other thing you'll notice here, the difference with the wax resist. On the hot press side, it's sort of quite definite lines, aren't they? And then you compare it to the rough, which is very, very textured, and then the sort of in between with the cold pressed paper there. And I'm just working my way down here, wet on dry, also using dry brush technique. And I thought it'd be quite interesting to see how easy it is to lift off damp paint. So I'm doing this with my size 10 brush. I've rinsed my brush, taken the excess off on a paper towel as I'm doing now, and letting that brush sort of soak up the paint there. I found it very easy to do this with the hot pressed, and as you can see there, not so much with the cold press paper there. It is lifting it off. I've had to give another go there. And finally with the rough paper, paint really sinks into the surface of the paper there as I'm lifting off, using exactly the same technique, but it's leaving a little bit of a residue there. What I'm trying out now is I'm dripping wet water into a drying background to create cauliflowers or back runs. So trying it on each of the surfaces here about the same time, and also in the sea. Now this can happen as a bit of a mistake, and I'm going to show you later how to remedy this as well. But as you can see there, straight away all of the papers are creating some quite interesting back runs there, some with more textures than others. I'm painting very quickly now some yellow ochre with my size 10 brush, working wet on dry. As you can see, some of the wax resist is coming through quite nicely there. But as you can see straight away with the rough paper, it does resist the paint a little bit, and you get some lovely light textures, especially at the bottom there. And it's quite nice for dry brush technique. I'm working wet in wet now, painting in some phthalo green light here, just to see how the paint behaves, painting wet in wet, which is quite nice. You can see with the hot press paper, it's run a little bit more. With the cold press, not so much. And with the rough paper, not so much at all. You've got more control over paint moving rapidly. I'm showing you here damp into wet. And as you can see there, you've got some nice effects. I'm using sort of damp paint here, painting in some grasses as well, just to show you the sort of different differences there with the surface of the paper and what it does. And here's a close-up just to give you an idea. So the hot press is a bit softer, and you can see why this would suit more detailed work because you've got more control. I love using Brusho, and I'll put a link in the description all about Brusho, but I'm actually sort of pierced a little hole in the top of this little drum, and I'm tapping out the Brusho medium there onto the wet surface just to see what happens and which paper it works best with. I'm quite interested in this. I'm giving it a little spritz of my spritzer bottle as well just to get the Brusho moving, but I really like the effect of the Brusho on the cold press paper actually, which quite surprised me. And I'm just pointing out here the back run on the water here with the cold press paper as well is the most defined back run. Now this is just ordinary table salt, and I'm going to sprinkling onto the damp surface of each sort of little painting here just to kind of compare the differences of the different surface paper with the salt. So I'm going to allow that to dry naturally. While that's drying, I'm just using a plastic card here. It's a store card. I'm scratching into the paper now, not lifting off with the card, but actually scoring and scratching the paper, which is permanent, just to see which one works the best. I have to say they all were quite good. And now I'm lifting off as well. You have to wait for the paint to sort of be damp, not too wet here to lift off. And as you can see there, it worked quite well with the hot pressed and the cold press. It's resisted a little bit here with the rough paper, which is quite interesting, but I do still like the effect though, and I love this technique. So I've allowed the painting to dry naturally just to see how the salt works, and here's a close-up, and I must say the salts work beautifully on all three, and you can see the Brusho looks fabulous as well. I would say the cold press worked really well, as did the hot pressed. The rough not as well actually as all three, but you may feel differently. This is an eradicator brush. It's just to lift off some of the dried paint here. So I've wet it, dried it off with my paper towel, and I'm just sort of trying to lift off backgrounds. For those of you who want to know how to remove backgrounds, this is how I teach it. So make sure your painting is dry first of all, then lift off with a damp clean brush and just work at it. That doesn't always work well, and I would suggest not doing this in a sky. It's very difficult to disguise a sky that's had a background, trying to fix it. But with here in the water, I can disguise this afterwards. So I'm lifting off there, working away, lifting off with a paper towel as well, and they all seem to be lifting off really nicely. I must say I love Saunders Waterford paper for this reason as well. And I would say the star of the show again looks like it's going to be the cold pressed. There's a bit more markings in the hot press there, and the rough as well looks a bit smudgy, but again it's a personal opinion. What I'm doing now is I'm just painting wet on dry some sea colour, and that's a little bit of the Cinnerous blue with some Paynes grey. And as you can see, the wax resist is still working really nicely there, and I've managed to cover the backgrounds as well quite well, definitely really well on the cold press, and looking not too bad on the rough as well. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry again, and I'm removing the masking fluid, and as you can see it reveals a lovely sort of white shape of a sail there and the reflection there, and it's quite nice and smooth on the hot pressed, and not too bad with the cold pressed as well, and it's come off on both surfaces really nicely. So I'm just going to remove it from the rough paper here, again coming off really nicely, and nice edges as well. So one of the techniques I've been using a lot lately is the bokeh technique, but it's a little bit about lifting off as well. But I just want to test out the different papers using this technique, see which one's best for it. And to be quite honest, they've all lifted off really well, especially the hot press there came off really nicely, nice and smooth, and left really nice clean edges as well on all surfaces. And I'll leave a link in the description below of some videos I made using this fabulous technique. As you can see above there, I've sort of finished off the white sailboats and reflections as well. I'm working on the foreground here using my size 4 brush, wet on dry, using a really lovely dark green, forest green with some Paynes grey, just to see the sort of differences of painting these sort of details here. Now, I will be really honest with you, the hot press was the easiest for painting these sort of fine details. So the rougher the paper became, the more trickier it became painting in finer details, and I would say that's the main difference between these papers. So if you want more detailed fine work, I would definitely go for the hot press paper. If you want an in-between that's great at all the different techniques, definitely go for the cold press. And if you want more sort of very expressive, impressionistic, sort of loose work, the rough paper is fabulous, and I really like using rough paper for very sort of expressive, rugged landscapes or seascapes or even cityscapes as well. So I'm painting some little birds in the distance there using my size 4 brush, and I had a little bit of a green blob there in the middle with the cold press paper, so that worked quite well. All 3 papers work well, but again smoother on the hot pressed. So I'm using a dry brush technique here, so it's the belly of the brush. There's not a lot of paint on the brush. I'm actually using white gouache to demonstrate this. As you can see there on the hot press, not too bad, cold press better, but the rough is the star of the show here. If you like dry brush technique, rough paper really is your best bet. So I'm finishing off with a spatter, which I like to do with all my paintings. It stops me from overworking, and I have to say all 3 papers worked really well with this technique. I'm now removing the washi tape just to see if any of the surfaces get torn or anything like that. But one thing I do know about Saunders Waterford, it doesn't mind tape so much, and this washi tape is really kind to watercolour paper, but you may find different manufacturer papers do tear, but they all fared well. And here are the 3 finished paintings, and I just thought I'd show where there was any warping there, and that's the rough paper. There's a little bit of warping. This is the cold press. You can see there's a little indentation there where the paper's warped up a little bit, and here is the hot press, and I would say the least warping out of all 3, which I found really interesting. And I was thinking maybe it's to do with the surface of the rough paper with the paint sinking in a little bit more and not so much on the hot pressed. I really hope you found this tutorial helpful in comparing the 3 different watercolor paper surfaces. I know I did. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section below, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to my watercolor channel so you won't miss out on any of my future tutorials. And if you want to watch longer, more in-depth, ad-free watercolor tutorials, check out my Patreon membership. Details about that are in the description below. Thank you for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.